Hello and good afternoon, everybody. I am Nomalanga from the Black Homeschool. You can find my course at thebblackhomeschoolguide.com. Thank you. Welcome for joining us. This is a homeschool Q&A hosted by the Black Business School. Today, I have a special guest. Her name is Cheryl. She runs a school in Florida. It's not a homeschool per se, but she is an expert in forming independent Black schools. And she has an online curriculum, which she will share a little bit more about. How are you doing today, Cheryl?
Excellent, excellent. My apologies for the phone ringing. I'll turn that off.
We didn't even notice. So Cheryl, before we get started and start taking questions and so on, let's just learn a little bit about you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came into this education and learning space?
Okay, I am from South Florida, the Broward County, Fort Lauderdale, and also Dade County, Miami. I'm a native of South Florida. And I went from South Florida as a student to California, where I studied at Stanford University. And I ended up getting a master's in education there. And it was always my intention there to learn to build schools that were specifically designed for Black children. I did not do a teaching degree. What I did was a research degree, and I researched schools inside of youth prisons or youth detention centers. And so I would go to those schools, and because there are actually schools inside of the prisons of the detention centers, and I would research how are they constructed, what is the curriculum, every minute little thing about the schools that were there in populations that were highly populated with Black children. So how were they teaching the lowest of the low? Because I felt like if I could dissect that, I could take that, reverse engineer it, and create something better. So that's what I did at Stanford. I spent most of my time inside of youth prisons for young Black children, inside of their schools, helping to educate them, helping to design curriculum for them, and writing theses based on that study. After leaving Stanford, I continued that same work. And I went to teach in other areas, low-income areas, Black areas, public schools, charter schools, all with the intent to pull out what is working, what is not working, because we have a conversation all the time about what's not working, right? So I had been in the school system as a student. I had been in the school system as a researcher, and then I went back into the system as an actual educator from that vantage point as well. And so I've taught in every system you can think of, public school, charter school, private school, free school, homeschool.
Excellent.
Yes.
So what really stood out to me just now is that you said that you were teaching Black children
Yes.
and underserved children.
Yes.
And what I've always heard education specialists who talk about Black boys and Black girls, but they focus more on Black boys, is that they learn different than the general population.
Yes.
And then the other thing is, if we're honest, the general population's public education system was not created with us in mind.
Absolutely not.
We were just the people who fought to get in.
Right.
And while we got in and got an education, that education was really not designed for us or for us
Right.
to benefit from it. So I'm really excited for you to offer your perspective as we answer questions.
Right.
If those of you that are just joining us, I am with Cheryl Irvin. She is an expert in forming independent Black schools, as you just heard. And we will be answering your homeschool questions. Those of you that don't know me, I am a homeschool mom, which is a very general way of putting it. We decided to transition from public school back in 2012. So we're about 8 years in this journey. I have a background in teaching. I was a college professor. I have a master's in teaching, but I always say that really, really, really means nothing when it comes to homeschooling, because I do not want parents to think, Nomalanga, you can homeschool, you have a degree in teaching and you have a background in teaching, and because it has no relevance. But it did help me in the beginning that I felt more confident in designing curriculum. And that's how I reassured myself that you can do this, you can do this. But again, teaching adults is a very different world than teaching small children. When I started teaching our children, my son had just come out of preschool and my daughter had just come out of first grade. So they were very small, and teaching them was a world apart from teaching at the college level, where I could just tell them, look, I ain't your mama, you know, you go figure it out. You're an adult. So it's been an interesting journey. As I mentioned, we do have a course at the Black Business School. It is at theblackhomeschoolguide.com. theblackhomeschoolguide.com. You can go there. It's only $1 right now for the first month, and then you pay $49 after that. I'd also like to share with you Cheryl's school website. It is say it for me again.
Alkebulan.
Newalkebulanschools.com. I will put it in the comment section so you can spell it correctly, and then I will also write it out so you can go and Google it if the link is misspelt by me for any reason. Okay, so guys, please do jump in, answer any questions. First of all, please let me know if you can hear me. It's very important for you to reassure me that you can hear me. For those of you that know me, you know me to be living in Boston, Massachusetts, but right now I'm in Botswana. You know, my internet may book out. And Cheryl, if it does, please feel free to stay on and I will find my way back into the webinar. I will say this is our third webinar. It's a webinar series that we're doing every week. For those of you that are joining for the first time, we do this every Thursday at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. Every Thursday, 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. And each time we're hoping to get an education or a learning specialist who can help us answer questions that you may have. Okay, so I'm seeing some questions in the chat, but guys, you can go into the questions and answer a question. Dee says, yes, you can hear me, and Wendy says, I can hear you fine, thanks. Okay, so I always want to answer this question because for whatever reason, it comes up every single time, and I'll let you answer it from your vantage point. Whenever we talk about homeschooling,
yes.
What's the first question? What about socialization? Okay, that question always comes up. So I'd like to get your take on it. And if somebody asked you in terms of homeschooling, how do you remedy that socialization? I guess concern. It's a concern, right? How do you remedy that?
Well, most of my students at my school are actually either former homeschool students or their parents are still homeschooling, probably the younger children, and they come in. So because we also have a homeschool option at the school, they can bring their child either part-time. In the morning, we do academics. In the afternoon, we do the project that pairs with those academics, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit later. So parents have the option of just bringing their children in for academics. Let's say they are like, oh, I'm not really proficient in algebra or whatever the core academic subjects we're going over. They have the option to bring them in and then pick them up at noon and then continue their homeschooling day. Or they say, I got the academics, but I do want them involved in hands-on projects with other children. They might bring them in at 1, and from 1 to 4, they're now building things with other children. So I say that to say that I'm very familiar with the homeschool community because most of my students have been in that environment at some point or another. I have also been a homeschooling mother. My son is now 17. But the vast majority of his education was managed by myself. And whenever I built my school in whatever city or whatever town, he was right there with me. So even though he was at a school, an independent school, because he was with me, it was very much like homeschooling in a sense. So what I find in terms of that fear of socialization, it's very much a misnomer. The children are not missing out. They're not going to come out not knowing how to speak to people, not knowing how to relate to people. And it depends on every individual child. Some children are just naturally shy, but that whole socialization piece has been very much a misnomer in my practice, right? A lot of my students will not have some of the same social cues, but it's the ones that you don't want them to have anyway.
Right, right.
Because we'll be talking about something in school, and because we read a lot of the heavy hitters today. This is the book that we're reading from today, the ISIS Papers by Francis Chris Wilson. And some of them like, what is racism? What is discrimination? So they'll come with those ideas like, haven't really learned a lot about that, but that's fine too. It's like the types of socialization that you don't necessarily want them to associate with, that's the stuff that they don't know. But in terms of how do I play with another child and how do I speak to an adult, I have not had that be a problem for the homeschooling parents that I've worked with. Now, I start with that. And then finish with, there are always groups that if you are a homeschooling parent who has taken on the challenge of just educating your child completely by yourself, there are always groups that you can join, or even institutions like my own that allow you to bring them in for interaction on certain things, on certain projects. Even some of the field trips that we'll go to, because we are out in the community a lot, we allow and invite people, homeschooling families from the community, to come with us on those things. We went to the Federal Reserve Bank when the children were studying about money. So all of these things that we open them up to the community. So it's just a matter of either joining groups online or doing searches online or doing a community search to find what's near you, where people are galvanizing to actually commune with each other outside of the home.
Right. And actually, I say this almost every webinar we do. I think actually that homeschoolers get more socialization than children who are in school.
Right.
Because we have less of a rigid day.
Right.
Sometimes a homeschooling day can be a whole field trip or a whole week of activities and learning, hands-on learning. So you're getting interaction with each other, right, with your parents, with right, other parents, other children. If you're going to the museum, right, there's just so much interaction that you're being socialized. And I love that you brought up that some of the socialization that happens in school is actually the kind of socialization that we don't want anyway.
Right.
One of the reasons that we took our children out of the public school system, my son never really, or our son never really entered because we took him out after preschool. But one of the reasons why we did that was we started to understand that a Black child's experience is different anyway in the school system. Right. And unfortunately, there's an underlying message that they're not going to behave, they're not going to learn well. They're quick to be labeled with learning disabilities and all these other things. And actually that is a form of socialization. There's a message yes, there that's yes, being told to the child. Yes. So actually I found that the socialization that people want their children to get in school, we actually didn't want that for our children. What right, do you think?
I find that most homeschool parents, that's one of the primary reasons why they don't want their children inside of the traditional public school system, is because they don't want that particular type of socialization. Because here's one of the things that I have been very mindful of in our institution, that we set the culture in the school. So for the first 2 weeks, they're not doing any academics. They're not, it's not heavily focused on what type of math are you doing. For the first 2 weeks, we just get acculturated to the space. How do we speak to each other? How do we greet each other? If an adult walks into the room, what do you do? So if you come into our institution and an adult walks into the room that they haven't seen that day, everybody stands up at the same time. They greet them in a certain way. They speak to them in a certain way. How do you speak to your peers? We spend the entire first 2 weeks on setting the culture of the space, because in the public school system, having been on all sides of it, like I said when I started, I one of the things that I noticed is that they set the rules. The authorities set the rules, but the children set the culture. The authorities set the rules, but the children set the culture. So if you happen to be in an area where the young people are into drugs and cursing come middle school or elementary school, or who has the best shoes and who is zooming who and who wants to fight who, and you think you cute, if you are in that environment as a child, the children bring that environment into the school and they set the culture of the schools, whereas the adults are setting the rules. And here's the difference. The culture is what permeates and what is done even when the adults are not looking. The rules are simply what is done when the teacher turns her head around, or ways to punish problems and stuff like that. The culture is so much more important than the rules. It's like the water that you're swimming in as a fish, or the air that you're breathing. So if your child is in that, there's no way for them not to be influenced or touched by it. So to remove them from that and to homeschool them, or to remove them from that and put them in an environment that has a culture that you agree with is the best thing I feel that you can do for your child. Because if you leave them in that space and think, oh, well, I'll just teach them Black history when they get home if I want them to learn Black history, or I'll just, all the academic things that they don't get, I'll just do that at home. But what about the water that they're swimming in all day? That culture that's set by the environment around them. You can't always remove
Control
that.
it. Yeah.
You can't control it, and sometimes you can't remove it, and you find that your children are being influenced by that when you actually start talking to them and see how they think. And you're like, who taught you? Like, whose child is this?
Or rather, who are you?
I didn't teach you that.
Right.
That those are things that they're getting from the water that they swim in.
I couldn't agree more. So Ray says, would you please respond to the article in Harvard Magazine that proposes a presumptive ban on homeschooling? I actually did read this article, and I'm going to be completely honest, I stopped halfway through because it was just annoying. But basically, as homeschoolers, we're used to people who will fall on either side. There'll be people who are curious and supportive. And of course, then there are those that absolutely support homeschool. That's one side. Then there'll be those who are still curious, but they're nervous. It's something they don't understand and they're just against it. And then there are others who have understood it and they're still just really, really against it because they don't see a reason for it. So this article that Ray is talking about went into a whole spiel about all the harm that can come to a child who is homeschooled. So what's your response to that, Cheryl?
Well, I don't know about other states, but in the state of Florida, homeschooling children and homeschooling students have to be, they have to submit at least once a year and maybe twice a year a portfolio that has to be analyzed. Both the child and the portfolio has to be analyzed by a licensed state certified teacher. So as a parent, you have to go and find an outside instructor who will put their license on the line to say that this child is being educated to the standards of their grade level, just that they are being educated, right? in a
Because that's
comparable
one of
way
the
to other
first
students.
concerns. That's one of the first concerns, that we're pulling children out of school and they're not actually getting an education. So
Right,
that answers that question, yes.
right.
Then the other thing is, in that article that it talks about, is that homeschoolers will take their children out of school, and they will do that so that they can molest them and abuse them. Before you continue, I'll just say, guess what? You can molest and abuse your children before they go to school and when they come back from school in the evening. But you go
And yeah,
ahead.
while they're enrolled, and as an instructor, like I've been teaching in the system since 1996, and as a mandated reporter, I'm not going to give any stories, but I can tell you I've seen it all and I've reported it all. So it's not that it happens in homeschool and it doesn't happen in other schools. And here's the thing, and I just saw one of the comments about indoctrination. All education is indoctrination. I say this all the time and I will repeat it again. All education is indoctrination, all of it. You simply, as a parent, get to decide, as a consciously thinking parent and intelligent parent, what am I going to indoctrinate my child into? What thought system, way of thinking, way of doing things, way of behaving and interacting with other people am I going to indoctrinate my child into? Because public schools, private schools, charter schools, all of that, you send your child to a Catholic school, they're being indoctrinated into a certain way of thinking. They have to show up at mass every morning. They have to pray in a certain way and bow down to the white Jesus on the wall and see the Mary in the cafeteria. All education is indoctrination. We have been made to think that education is academic. Education may be 20% academics, but it's 80% acculturation and indoctrination into a certain way of being and thinking. And as a homeschooling parent, you're simply saying, I am going to control that. I have the right to do that. And I am going to control that for my child. And so there's not such thing as there's indoctrination and then there's education. It's, you cannot separate the two. You can't separate the two.
Right. And I would also say that, like I said in the beginning, the public education system was not created with a Black child in mind.
No.
In fact, at the time that it was created, Black children were not allowed in schools in the first place. So the reason why I'm bringing that up is that there may be indoctrination, but is it indoctrination for the benefit of that child or to the detriment of that child? And as a parent, you get to choose indoctrination, if that's your choice of word, that benefits, that is to their benefit,
Exactly.
and that is in line with your values,
Exactly.
your religion, if you have a religion, or
Yes.
lack of religion, whatever it is, you get to decide and carve out the path, at least until that child is an adult. You don't let a school system that wasn't designed for them in the first place,
Right.
and people who believe that they're in the classroom to distract, disturb, cause trouble, because this is well documented. The preschool to prison pipeline for Black boys and now
Yes.
also Black girls starts at 5 years old. And you can speak more to that, Cheryl, since you've actually gone in and studied and seen. It starts with a child at 5 years old saying they have a behavioral problem. It becomes part of their record, and then it follows them throughout most of their life,
Yes.
all the way up until they're an adult and they're in the prison system.
Right.
So thank you for bringing that up, Cheryl. Elisa says this is inaudible. I'm not sure what she's talking about. Tell us a little bit more. For those of you that are here, also just joining us, we have a few more people that came in. I am Nomalanga. I am an instructor at the Black Business School. We have a course that was designed to transition parents and children from the public school system to homeschooling. It is at theblackhomeschoolguide.com, theblackhomeschoolguide.com. I am your host. Our guest today is Cheryl. She is an expert in forming independent Black schools. And I actually typed in the course that we have at the Black Homeschool, and I also typed in Cheryl's school. So if you just look in our comment section, you'll see the links. Dee says, I'm a teacher
Yeah.
and spend the time a child is in second grade, a black boy's box for learning begins to go out. So she's saying basically that the way that children are treated in the public school system, they become disengaged and they don't want to learn. I know you want to say something, Cheryl.
I think she says sped ed, like special ed.
Oh, okay, special ed. Sorry,
Yeah, I
yes.
think that's what she's saying. I not only from my research, but my own personal experience. I have one son, just he's 17 now, I did not put him in preschool. I educated him myself up until he was about first grade. I wasn't going to put him in elementary school either. My intention was to homeschool. Um, and as I was building the school that he was going to go to. But in second grade, I did put him in school. By the time he got there, he everything in terms of math and reading and all of that stuff was way above the grade
The
level
grade level.
that he was classified as. He was very gifted in math very early on, and I nurtured that from a very early age. But when he got into second grade, I put him in a very prominent charter school in our area. You have to be in a lottery to get in, and it's just like a coveted place to be in. We got chosen for the lottery in second grade, so he starts to go to there. But I know my son. I know how precocious he is. I know he's been at home and he's been able to speak. He's
There's
been
more
able,
freedom.
right, he's been able to direct a lot of his learning and to say like, okay, we, I've got the addition, I've got the multiplication, I got that. Let's go on to like, he liked algebra because it was like puzzles, like putting puzzles together and moving things around. He liked that element. So he is second grade, right? Precocious. And but he had an older white female teacher who was very impatient with him. She didn't want him getting up to help the other students because he would do that all the time. She didn't want him getting up to talk or calling out the answer because he would do that all the time. He just should not have been in second grade, but he was very, very precocious. Um, and he started acting out because she was suppressive of all of the ways that he had been allowed to be excited at home about excited about the learning and then and saying yes, 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 here's the answer, here's the. And so now that's being dampened in class because there's 20 something other students in the room and it can't just be about you. I get it, I understand. I've been on the other side of that. But now he's starting to act out. He's starting to cry. He's starting to put his head down. He's starting to
He's disengaging
he's
also. Yeah.
he's disengaging, but it's an outward disengagement, an anger, a frustration. Like you're not letting me speak, right? So I get a call from the school telling me to come out to the school that my son has just, blown up and had a tantrum. I get there and I see two police cars parked out front. I didn't think anything about it because there are service members inside of the school, right? Those two police cars were there for my son in the second grade. I didn't know it at the time, but I went in. They had ushered all of the other children out, and he was in like sequestered over in a corner with adult police bodies standing around him, and he's just in a corner. And the teacher said that he was screaming. He was a danger to himself and others. She had to clear the room. I'm like, did he bring a semi-automatic to school that I don't know about? Like, how is this second grader a danger to you, himself, and the other students? Oh, he was throwing the tennis balls from the bottom of the chairs. I put tennis balls on all the balls. Mm-hmm. He flipped over the chair and he was throwing the tennis balls from the bottom of the chair. I was like, okay, what happened? Like, how did he get to that point? Mm-hmm. But before I could, find out how it got there, I was told by administration that he had been Baker acted. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what Baker acting is, but Baker acting is a legal term that simply means you have been deemed a danger to yourself and or others and now they can take you to the hospital and or police station where you can be detained for up to 3 days. And they did this to
And
a
how
second
old
grade.
was he? How old was he?
Was in second grade, so that must have been 6 or 7 years old.
7, yeah, 7 or 8, yeah.
Yeah, about 7 years old. So I am like, what is going on? And so the police turn to me and they say, you can either put him in the car and drive him to the hospital, or we will put you in the car and drive you to jail as they drive him to the hospital. So I put him in the car. We drive him to the hospital with the police driving behind us to make sure I am admitting him to the hospital because he's been Baker acted. And now he's in the back seat in his car seat. He's still in a car seat, you know. And I'm asking, now he's just playing with his toys and everything's fine. I'm like, what happened? And he said, she wouldn't listen to me. I kept trying to tell her and she wouldn't listen to me. And then eventually when she just wouldn't listen to me, she was screaming. She ended up screaming at me. And then I screamed back and then it just escalated, right? So we get him to the hospital. He's happy. He's playing. He doesn't even know what's going on, 6, 7 years old. The doctor takes him in the back. I was not allowed to go. And I was blessed to have a physician who came back with a written report and said, there's nothing wrong with your son. Your son is gifted. I don't know why he's there at that school in that class, but this boy is like, and this is what she wrote down on the paperwork. Didn't keep him overnight, didn't keep him for the 3 days. She just gave me the paperwork and said, your child is gifted. There are certain propensities of gifted children that you need to learn about, and that you need to educate towards, and you can take him home. And she gave me a book on gifted children. And that was my first time learning to educate gifted children. Of course, I withdrew him from that school the next day.
Right.
But it was just my own personal experience with you. Here you have an adult woman who feels like she can't, she was literally afraid of my son. And my son's not a big child. He's not a big 6 or 7. He's a small boy. Yeah. But here she was, felt afraid enough to Baker Act my child in a way that he could have been hospitalized for 3 days without me.
And that would have gone on his record. And
yes.
You know, I'm so grateful that you were able to take him out of the school, because sometimes parents can't do it right there and then, and they bring them back to that same school.
Yes, to the same school, to the same
now
teacher,
they have,
in the same class, with instructions, strong instructions, I'll say, to the child that you better not mess up again.
Yeah.
And that then just compounds the trauma that they just experienced. And they feel like the whole disengaging from education can happen with one experience, with one teacher, with one way that a teacher looks at you, talks to you. And that experience could have been something that got him to go in another direction had I not had the ability to kind of take control over that situation and start homeschooling him again.
Absolutely. And that is, you know, as we said before, that is that part of that socialization. That is how they're socialized, that if you ask too many questions and you're too eager to learn and help and what have you, that's bad. You're bad, and you're going to get in trouble, and you're going to get removed.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get blackballed, and, you know, it just gets worse and worse from there. Yeah. I don't see any questions in the question portal, that little question box that we have. But I did want you to kind of tell the people that are listening about curriculum. You specifically basically specialize in independent Black schools.
Yes.
So what exactly is different about a Black school? What are the key things that makes it a quote unquote Black school?
Well, there's a difference between a Black school and an African-centered school. because a Black school, by definition, is you're going to have majority of students in there that are of African descent in some way, right? But if the culture of the school, if the curriculum of the school, if you're just trying to mirror what other public schools are doing so that you can get them to perform on those same state standardized tests, you have not changed the paradigm of which your child is being educated in. I'll say that. And I'll say that to homeschoolers as well. If you're at your home trying to replicate what they're doing in school so that your child can simply pass the state standardized tests, you are not taking on that, like I said, 20% academics, 80% acculturation. I won't say indoctrination because that word triggers some people, but acculturation. If you have not taken that into account, you have not changed the educational dynamic for your child, right? That being said, an African-centered school, what it attempts to do is allow the child to see the world from their own perspective. It makes them and people in their genetic heritage center to the formation of culture and academics and intelligence, and then expands out from there and includes the rest of the world in much the same way that a Eurocentric education does. You go into a Eurocentric education and you're going to learn about whatever. You're going to learn about government. Let's say you learn about government. If you're learning about government in a Eurocentric education, they might start you off with the Greeks in the way that they have set up their government system, and then go from the Greeks to the Latins to now how it's done in the United States, right? We don't start from there. We start from systems that were traditionally African, showing how those traditional African systems were then influenced the Greeks, okay, and other people around the world, and how those systems are still kind of connected or disconnected, how they could continue to work, what would need to be adjusted. So you make that child the center of their own learning, so they think everything started with them because it
did, right? And I was also going to add that even if you just look at the presidents in America up until we got Barack Obama, it was just a bunch of white guys, and that's
right.
got not, there's no connection,
Right.
and it already, I like to say others, it others the child,
Right.
a Black child in a white.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of most of when you say that the public school system was not set up for our children, right? Most of that is subtle and subconscious. Most of that is subtle and subconscious. If you go in and you don't see yourself in the work that you're doing, it, like you're saying, it makes them feel subconsciously like, where am I in this? It makes them really start to feel like white people did everything, or that white people did everything first, and then we can simply be a first of the Black people who've already done what white people did. That is psychological abuse on a Black child, particularly and especially a Black male who is charged with being strong in a certain way. And then you get from very early on psychologically that you have no ability to do that. All that you can do is be the second to the first who's already done it, right? So we don't start from there. Everything that they do starts from with themselves at the center of the learning, and then they're learning externally outward from there.
And I like that you tied that into homeschool, because that is what we also should be doing, rather than taking the public school system and bringing it into our house.
Right.
We have to actually, quote unquote, detox from it, and then try to build something that is different from it, because otherwise, what's the point really of
Right.
taking your child out of the public school system? I don't know if you can see a question from Alicia. She says, do you recommend any Black history books for elementary school students? Before you answer, Cheryl, I will ask you to give me a list of books if you have it, so I could put it over. I'm compiling a list of resources for the parents who are interested in homeschooling or who are already homeschooling. But you can go ahead and answer the question.
Okay, so that's something I will be able to give you to post at another time.
Right.
I can't like type it in right now, but
Oh, you can. I'm just saying if you have more, feel free
okay,
to give them to me and I'll add them to our resources.
okay. So in our curriculum, what we have done is take some of the resources that are already there. There are books for on Black history that are geared toward elementary school students. Um, but if they aren't there in our curriculum, what we do is like the ISIS papers. You're not going to find an elementary version of the ISIS papers. But what I will do, and a lot of times, is take the main points and the elements of it and create cartoons with the main points of the book. So even the 5-year-olds can follow along with the ISIS papers, whereas the 12-year-olds are actually reading from the book itself. So as a homeschool parent, now this is one of the things that as homeschool parents that we are absolutely have to do is take the material and adjust it ourselves a lot of times. Sometimes you're not just going to find a ready-made curriculum. Where you can find that at schools like mine, schools like the Uhuru Academies, and other African centered schools who have taken the time to like really pare down this information for the children that are there. And now maybe they're selling certain parts of what they do or giving out certain parts of what they do. And some of the material that I've created and that I've used, I will forward over to Nomalanga and she can post it for everyone. But I have created the curriculum that we use in our school. And a lot of that uses pre-existing books, but a lot of that uses what would be considered adult material, but just taking it and putting it in cartoon form so that the younger ones, 5, 6, 7, can follow along with the main ideas of what's being expressed.
Another question is, how can a person homeschool their children if they don't have a lot of money or a lot of time? So actually, those are two big questions just by themselves. There's a financial issue, which actually sometimes isn't just about if you have the money to buy the curriculum and the resources and the tools, but also that it takes you away from a job. You can't, sometimes people feel like you can't be homeschooling and be working at the same time. So you have to think about that part.
Absolutely.
And then that it don't have a lot of time.
Some people have to work. Some people just have to work. I would caution against just putting your child in front of a computer. That's just me. Because there are online systems that are available to you for free from the public school systems. K-12 is one here in the state of Florida, and basically what they have is the same academic classes but online, where the child has to use more autonomy to get that work done, and then they might provide teachers that they can consult with on an online basis. I think that is very isolating. I think that is very isolating.
I want to say though, Cheryl, that I actually have encouraged parents, like when they're in a homeschool environment and there's a subject that they don't feel comfortable teaching, to use that resource for that specific subject and then have, the quote unquote normal homeschool environment for everything else. Because what I do like about that is it has a concept and then a concept test, so you can be assured that the child is actually learning
proficient in the skill. Right. No,
Yes.
that's not what I'm talking about. When I say I will caution against just sitting your child in front of a computer. But one of the things that you can do in terms of money, there's so much free resources and materials online, whether it's YouTube University or Khan Academy, or there's just so many free resources online. And then if you have the time to actually um, pair that with activities, that's even better. Or you can find homeschool co-ops to where I have some mothers who were I ran a co-op at one point where you'd have one mother who would take this week, one mother who would take this week, or one mother who would take this subject because she's more proficient at it. And just working together as a community, there are options. You have your homeschool co-op, you have your institutions or small schools like mine who might allow for like a hybrid homeschool being in the community, but that requires some resources going out. But there, in terms of just resources that you can pull for free, there are an infinite number of free resources that you can pull to design what you're going to give to your child.
I would also add that if you don't have a lot of money or a lot of time, you can start off with what you're calling a hybrid. I used to call it supplemental homeschooling. So you don't necessarily pull your child out of the school system, but you kind of do a trial period where you're kind of supplementing and you get a feel for how much it's going to cost, how much time it's going to take. And you'll often find that there are homeschoolers who actually homeschool for only 2 hours a day in terms of where it's, that focused curriculum or textbook kind of learning. It's only 2 hours a day, and sometimes it's not even every single day. But again, I have yet to meet a homeschooler who didn't have their child go back into the public school system and wasn't further ahead than the children in that grade. It always happens. Even if they're in school 1 hour a day or whatever it is, the homeschool environment is such a positive learning environment that those children always end up ahead. They might be behind in some things that maybe you didn't focus on or weren't hammering them to keep on track about, but in general, they'll always be ahead. So I'm always saying, don't worry about that. Don't worry about falling behind and how much time and all that. So I'm just kind of answering that question of that you don't have a lot of time. And then the second thing is that homeschoolers are extremely independent compared to children who are used to being in school. They're almost like college.
If you pull your child out of school and they're not used to being independent, you do have to train them up.
There's a transition, yes. There's a transition period. But over time, they just learn to be more independent learners, especially if you're a parent who really embraces child-led learning. They tend to just get used to learning on their own and creating opportunities for learning, being inquisitive. So it ends up not being as time consuming as it looks in terms of when in school, the teacher's there the whole time and they're actively doing something the whole time. But with homeschooling, we used to get to a point where sometimes my children would be an hour or two, or our children would be an hour or two into homeschooling before I was even asked anything or did anything, because we had already agreed at the beginning of the week that these are your assignments, these are your activities, and so forth. And they could read and write. So they could read like, oh, today I'm supposed to read this book, and then I'm supposed to have a summary, I'm supposed to do this. So they become much more independent if you teach, if you really focus on that in the transition period. And as Cheryl said, in terms of money, you do have a lot of free resources, and you should always tap into your community. There'll be people who already passed that grade level and they're happy to give you the resources that they don't need anymore, and they'll share. The one thing that I love about homeschool moms is we love sharing. If you create little activities and things,
I figured it out.
And then you want to share with everybody. So if they create something like you said, cartoons, you could just photocopy that and spread it out in your co-op or in your community. The thing that I've emphasized in every single webinar is create a community, because the community is what's going to support you and help you. And when you have a community, you do better, both as the educator or the parent, and the children also do better because they have a supportive community.
Absolutely. And don't feel
Yeah.
like you have to be the only one to teach your child everything. You don't have to
Right.
be the only teacher that they have. I have one mother who basically uh, informally ran her own uh, independent school out of her home because she had 10 other, including her son, she had up to 10 students who came to her every day, for not all day, certain parts of the day, because their parents were working, and
Right.
they have contracted with her. Um, they have an agreement with her about how she, homeschools. She's already homeschooling her own children, so I'll homeschool your child too. And we're gonna go here today and here today and here today. And so if you have someone like that in your sphere, um, that you can trust your child with, um, you don't always have to be the one to actually teach them everything. Right.
So Maggie says, hi, I'm new to homeschooling. What do you recommend for an 11-year-old for history curriculum to learn? So before you answer, Cheryl, Maggie, I think Cheryl could spend a whole hour just talking about that.
Yeah.
So I just want to keep reminding you all that I am, constructing a resource list, or a bunch of resources that you can go and find. The link is theblackhomeschoolguide.com. Because the course is a paid course, what I'm going to do is I can actually offer parts of it that you see before enrolling. So I'll just do it as a preview and I'll add those resources there.
Right.
But go ahead, Gerald, you want to give it a
I,
shot?
I just clarification on how I do it and how I found it best to do, right? And this our curriculum, we call it Roots to STEM. Roots being the African-centered nature of it, and STEM being science, technology, engineering, mathematics, right? So Roots to STEM. Um, I have an not only African-centered curriculum, but it's also very much project-based. I don't look at what history curriculum am I using. We don't even start from that premise, right? So what are we creating in our children? Our motto is that we're creating creators. We are creating creators. That's the motto of the school. Every child knows it. And they know that why are you here? What are we creating? We're creating thinkers. We're creating creators. Children who know how to create things, who have the propensity to create things, because that's what we need for our community. We talk all the time about people not just going out to get a job, but creating the jobs that we need. Okay, at our school, we create creators. So we start from a project. That's where we start, not from what history curriculum is. We start from a project. What are the children going to build? What are they going to be looking at the construction of and physically putting their hands on to build? And then outwardly from there, we pick all the academics that relate to what they're building. What that creates is a sense of relevance. No child in my school has ever asked, why am I doing this? What are we doing this for? When am I ever going to use this? That used to be a pet peeve question of mine as an educator in all of the schools that I'm in, because you don't have a good answer for them. You don't have a good answer in that moment, right? But in my school and in the Roots to STEM curriculum model, and you're starting from something that they're building, and then you look out from there as the academics, they never ask the question because they are actually using it. So for specific example, one of the last, our first semester project was called Got Drive with a question mark. And they built a car, like a full on, they had to draw out the blueprint, the schematics. We looked up things online. They cut the wood. It was an electric car. They used PVC piping, put it all together, and it was an electric car that ran at the end, right? So now we know we're building a car. What is the academics for that, right? So The science for that, we're looking at physics, because you got drive, you got speed, you got acceleration, you got momentum. So all of them at every level learn physics. How do you teach physics to a 5-year-old? The concepts can be simplified. It's not just because you learned it in high school or because it's in a high school book that they're overly complicated concepts. There really aren't. You can look up physics for first graders, physics for kindergartners, and you can take those same concepts of speed, momentum, acceleration, and it gives you cartoons and all types of things that you can give them the concept, right? So now here's our science, right? So in order to learn that science, what mathematics do you need to also be looking at while you're doing that? Always foundational mathematics with the 4 basic adding, subtracting, multiplication, division. Always, always, always. But now you have to add some elements of pre-algebra because they are doing physics, and formulas for speed and acceleration and stuff like that. So you add that into your math. And now they know why they're doing it, because in the afternoon when they're building, they actually have schematics that they have to use that math for, right? So then history. Well, if you're talking about driving and history, how do you relate that? How do you pair that? Well, we did a history of movements, because we're talking about movement, right? Across the diaspora. So we did the apartheid movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the civil rights movement, the it was like 6 or 7 different movements, and they learned this concept of what a movement is socially. It's when you're blocked or you have an impediment. All of these things, all of these concepts that relate to drive. And then you have the drive to move forward regardless of what barrier is there. So they look at these different movements: the civil rights movement, the anti slavery movement, abolitionist movement, like all of these movements. This is the history that they're getting. And you start with the one earliest in time to the most recent one. And so then we did psychology in terms of psychological drive. The reading and the writing also relating to drive, acceleration, momentum. So make it all relevant to what they're building, and when they have to put their hands on it and when they have to use it, they will never ask you, why am I learning this? Because
Right.
they'll be using it, right? And so you pick the history that fits with what they're
Whatever you're doing.
with what they're physically putting together. And it doesn't have to be like a big massive car like we had them build. Before they built the big electric car, they built cars that were made out of cardboard and balloons.
Very simple. And speaking of relevance, we had like when I first got married, my husband was African American, and I was born and raised in Botswana. I came to the United States when I was a teenager. So I do have a slight accent, if you really pay attention. So,
Yes.
when I was meeting my nieces and nephews, one of the questions they would ask is, why does she talk like that? Well, because she learned a different language or knows a different language from a different place. Do you know it turned into a whole week's worth of these were a homeschool family with my nieces and nephew, and those 5 of them all at different grade levels. But I mean, Botswana became a whole thing. They learned Botswana history, and then the countries, other African countries, they learned about the culture, the music, the dance. I mean, it went on and on, the currency and the history, and it just went on and on and on. But they were so curious about me and curious about where I come from that it just had that relevance, and I was there to support their learning in terms of if they couldn't find the information, I knew where to find the information if I didn't know it myself. So to this day, they're compared to other children anywhere in their neighborhood or whatever. They're just more knowledgeable because they actually have a person right there that they know who's a resource for them.
Right.
And it just goes to your idea of relevance. If something is relevant,
Absolutely.
they're more engaged, they're more
Make it
excited
relevant.
about it. and it has more meaning to them than if you just said, we're going to learn about Africa today.
Right.
Yeah. And another example is when they do family trees, and then you start realizing that, oh, in our family tree, actually, you know, you can dig in and you find that, oh, we have roots in such and such a country. Oh, what's that country? And then, like, for instance, our children and their paternal family, if you dig deep, in, not very far, their grandfather was from the Caribbean, from the Bahamas.
Okay.
So now they were learning about the Bahamas, and actually we were planning a trip to the Bahamas, and we're gonna go. And you see, it's like a rabbit hole in a good way, where you
Yes,
can
absolutely.
just keep going and getting pulling so many lessons.
Right.
So we've been going for about an hour. Are you good to go for another 10, 15 minutes
I'm
so we can
good.
grab another couple?
I'm good.
So Effie says, does compulsory education purposely create the achievement gap? Does compulsory education purposely create the achievement gap? You'll be better able to answer that question, Cheryl. I haven't been in the public school system. But before we answer that, I just wanted to acknowledge some of the comments here. Pamela says she's using the sankofaclub.com along with the Black Financial Literacy cards. The Black Financial Literacy cards are actually part of the Black homeschool. I'm sorry, the Black Business School. And actually, if you go to the blackbusinessschool.com, there's a lot of financial courses for children that you can incorporate in your homeschool. The first person was Madam C.J. Walker. The financial cards are paired with that lesson are cash, income, money, investor, producer, consumer. I think everybody can see each other's comments, but I just wanted to acknowledge the comments. And Loretta says she loves how you put that together. Got drive. So to the question, Cheryl, does compulsory education, compulsory being mandatory education, create the achievement gap? What do you think?
I don't think it's that because the education is mandatory that the gap is created. I think there are a lot of systemic factors that are included with that. So it's not the fact that it's mandatory that creates the gap. You only start actually seeing the gap, and you can, if you've read Amos Wilson or any of those educational psychological scholars, African children and children of African descent are actually far more precocious and develop faster from the ages of 0 to 5 up until that third grade kind of age range that you have there, from 0 to 7. They're actually a lot more precocious. They've done studies on when they hold their head up faster, they
can you use another word for precocious?
Precocious simply means learning fast, being fast for
because
your age.
precocious sometimes has a negative connotation, like you're a little like sassy kind of.
Okay, well, I've never used it that way. But
more advanced. The advanced quicker, you're saying.
It is advancing faster. And we have, I'm just take a little second to warn us specifically as of African American Black parents to not suppress that in your child, right? Because some of us, not all of us, but you may have experienced this, where a child is doing something fast and they'll be called fast and grown. Look at you rolling your head up already. What you need to go sit down somewhere already. You walking already 9 months. You and your teeth already. And I understand it's because of lack of information, but we do that to our children, and I understand the historical relevance behind how and why we have done that. It was almost a protection measure, as Joy DeGrasse talks about in post-traumatic slave syndrome. But we have to stop doing that, because that's actually a good thing. It's actually a really good thing if we can learn to nurture that and really forward that in our children now, and let go of our fears towards it from the past, we can help propel them forward a lot faster. I took a moment to do that little aside because that is working in tandem with the system as well. That's working in tandem with the system. So your child is growing faster, they cut their teeth faster, they hold their head up faster, they're walking sooner. They All of these things are scientifically proven, not by Black people, but by sociologists and scientists who have proven that children of African descent are faster in that sense from those ages. Now you put them into a schooling environment. You put them into a schooling environment where they're starting to associate with language and symbols in a more direct way. They're starting to associate with language and symbols in a more direct way. And they're starting to get the messages about themselves that dampen that precociousness, right? Whether it's overtly there or just embedded within the context, like I said, with the curriculum where they never see themselves. Or if you do have 1 month, they're talking about slavery, but slavery is never talked about in a way where you're actually an honored victim. You're just a victim. Like, depending on how you do it. Like, so you have these subtle elements combined with the not so subtle. If you have a teacher that's afraid of you or that wants to dampen that and quiet that down, and now you have to sit, because a lot of our boys and a lot of our children, they do need to be building something and doing something and moving. They're kinesthetic learners and not given the opportunity to be that in the classroom. So now all of these elements, not that it's compulsory, but that it has all of these subtle and then sometimes not so subtle elements that's taking that what we call fast and slowing it down and slowing it down and slowing it down. And you can see that reverse when you homeschool, like Nomalanga was saying, that you get them out and you can teach them in a year what it took a teacher, you can teach them in a month what it took to teach them in an entire year, because now you're putting back what has been being depleted by the system that they have to adhere to every day. So, and I don't blame a lot of teachers or schools for doing it consciously. I simply hold them accountable for consciously undoing it, looking at all the ways in which our children are being suppressed and now consciously undo those things, right? If you know that Black boys are more kinesthetic learners and that they move around, some of the boys in my class, I can be talking and they're here like this the whole time, or they're even looking at the pencil because it's making wavy. Like, in a public school classroom, you will be yelled at, you will be given detention or what have you. But I know that child, and I know
Or
that
be given ADHD
or
medication.
be given ADHD medication. I know that child, and I know that he's actually listening to me. Even inside, he's actually listening to me. So all I have to do is say, Joseph, what is the last thing I said? He tells it to me. We keep it moving. You know?
Right.
But the need to maintain order amongst the group, the need to have everybody tend toward the middle, and outliers being more of a problem than they are either gifted or let me find out what's going on with you. It's just so many things that are there that your individual child can fall through the cracks, especially if you're that parent that if the teacher calls and says, Joseph is just moving all the time and he's all over the place with the pencil and if you don't take the time to find out, is he actually getting it? Like, and you just go with what the instructor says, and you punish the child for moving too much, for acting out too much, that just deepens and worsens the problem, right?
And I mean, we, again, I always reiterate that the school system is not always, the public school system is not always the ideal setting for learning anyway.
Right.
It's actually not normal or good for them to sit for long periods of time. To me, it actually feels abusive. I've had to always compose myself when I see parents, even whether it's church or the hospital, wherever it is, and they keep yelling at their child or chastising them for sit still. It's actually unnatural for them to sit still, you know? And this is like a subtle form of abuse, but we've normalized it that they should sit still. And if they don't sit still, then they need medication that's gonna kind of dull them and make them sit still. So I think it's very important to always be bringing that up. And I love the example that you gave where they were building something. So they are, they're engaged, they're using their hands, and they're not being asked to just sit still and listen to somebody talking to them who's usually boring them anyway. So we've been,
okay, I'm doing math for 40 minutes. I need to get this concept, because when we go over to
we're gonna go and meet it over there. Yes, that's actually how my son was encouraged. He was really good at math, and when he was in first grade, he was already doing second and third grade. I've shared this before, second and third grade math, but with reading and writing, he was actually more of a kindergartner. And how we made the leap forward was he was interested in coding so that they could create cartoons. And then he realized that in order to learn how to code, you had to read the instructions. I mean, he, within just a couple of months, was so motivated to start learning how to read. And to this day, he is a voracious reader, because reading is usually the obstacle between the information that he wants or needs
what he wants to
do something, right? So everything that he wants to do, something he wants to explore, you got to read how to do it. So he absolutely loves reading, because it's a portal to what he wants to get to anyway.
Yes, that is an excellent technique, and that's what we do. And what you're just saying, pair what they are going to want to do with something that they need, need to do, right? So we have another project around sports, right? So if you want your child to learn their shapes and their geometry and their angles and the degrees and all of these things, recess, we're playing basketball, we're playing football, but you can't play if you don't know the angles. Like, there's a square on the back of the basketball goal, and if you hit that square at a certain angle, the ball is always going to go. That's what a layup is. Layups are nothing but angles in geometry, right? So if they know that when we're doing geometry, we're learning that on recess, they get to play basketball and learn layups and get better at that. But if you, how can you go and do the basketball if you don't know the angles? And sorry, so they will sit through 30 minutes of angles because they
just to get to the fun part.
Recess is coming up. So if you make it interest-based or project-based, something that is relevant to them, and they will take over for themselves, and you won't have to keep saying, sit down, sit down, sit down, sit down.
Cheryl, we've kind of gone for 75 minutes, and usually we try to shoot for about an hour. We have enough questions answered. I just want to say thank you, Cheryl. Thank you for joining us. I did type in your link to your school, and I will be following up with you to get a few more resources that we can add to our resource pile. Yes, thank you. Thank you guys for joining us. Again, you can visit New Alkebulan, newalkebulanschools.com. I did type it in, as I said, on the chat over here. You can also go to theblackhomeschoolguide.com. We're offering the course for just $1 as we're doing this. Mind you, the reason why we actually started to do this series is because most people everywhere in the world are stuck at home.
Yeah.
And even people who never thought they wanted to do homeschooling are kind of doing some version of it. So this is why we're doing this series, is to help parents at home. And that's why we're offering it for $1. It's at theblackhomeschoolguide.com. It's $1 for the first month, and then after that, you do have to pay the $49 that it costs. So thank you so much, Cheryl, and thank you guys for joining us.
Yes. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.